Hello there, and welcome to my little revision video all about dear old tiny Timothy in A Christmas Carol. So, just like normal, I'm going to go through the four quotes I would make and the points I would make, layering up those interpretations, and I've colour coded them so you can see how you're hitting all the elements of the mark scheme the examiner needs to give you top marks. So, if a question came up in my exam and it was about how does Dickens portray the character of Tiny Tim, in my introduction I'd be straight up establishing that he represents the surplus population. Now, if anyone is not aware, the surplus population was the ingenious idea of this guy called Malthus. And it was his thinking, his economic thinking, that drove the poor law of the Victorian period. And essentially, that poor law said that the surplus population, those are the folks that are costing our society rather than contributing to it, they should just hurry up and die off. And Tiny Tim is that representation of the surplus population, and we'll talk about why shortly. I'd also put in my introduction, though, how Dickens is showing that these people, this apparent surplus population who apparently serve no financial gain to our society, well, actually, their worth is not measured in money. Their worth is measured by something far more powerful, far deeper, and that is love. And we're going to see how Tiny Tim brings joy, brings happiness, brings love to the people around him, and how ultimately he actually saves Scrooge by showing him how to love. So, in my essay about Tiny Tim, what points would I have to make, in my opinion? First of all, I would talk about his tiny crutch and how that tiny crutch is a symbol for the devastating impact of the poor law. I would then talk about this biblical analogy of blind men see. When Bob Cratchit comes back from the church, he makes a point of saying that Tiny Tim made a profound comment about how it would be good to remember who made blind men see. Well, I would argue that actually it is Tiny Tim that's helping the blind man see. The blind man obviously being Mr. Scrooge. I then talk about how when he died, there was no tears, there was no uproar, there was no devastation. It was inevitable, so it was accepted. And then at the end, when Scrooge has gone through his redemption, I think it's really, really beautiful that Dickens gives the last line to Tiny Tim and leaves us with that final image of Scrooge being like a father to him, and then both going on to lead a fuller, happier life together. So here we go then. So I'm going to go in chronological order as per usual, and I'm going to start off with this first one here, Tiny Crutch. Now, that's a Malthusian symbol of the surplus population, as I was saying in the introduction. Tiny Tim, he's lame, he's sick, he's disabled, he's exactly the sort of drain of society that Malthus was going on about. And indeed, Scrooge echoes Malthus's point of view in his research and his thinking. At the start, it makes a comment to the charity workers when they come round to his shop to ask him for some money. He says if he were to die, he'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. Dickens very deliberately gets Scrooge repeating verbatim, word for word, what Malthus was saying in his research. Now, the repetition of the tiny here, that shows how vulnerable he is, shows how weak he is, and they use the word tiny for Tiny Tim all the way through, not only in his name, not only as a description of him as a person, but Bob Cratchit time and again keeps referring to him as tiny, and even in his death he was such a tiny boy. Now that shows that even though he's vulnerable, even though he's weak, he's truly precious, and we see how truly powerful he is in terms of the difference he can make later on. We've also got that symbol of the crutch. Now if you think about what a crutch does, crutch helps you get by, it helps you get from A to B if you've broken your leg, but it doesn't fix your leg, it doesn't improve your condition. So that's a symbol for the poor law. It only maintains the poverty, only maintains the survival of the poor. It doesn't actually help them out of it or rectify the intrinsic issues that drive poverty. And finally, this crutch is all the way through, even to the point that when Tiny Tim dies, there's just the crutch left on its own by the fireplace. And so like the poor law and the poor, at the end, the poor will die off, just like Tiny Tim does, but their means of survival, that poor law, that's the one thing that remains. almost showing that the financial decisions of the government are the things that are abiding and long lasting, and to them, the people that they're meant to be helping do not matter. Now, my next quote is here, blind men see, which is a biblical analogy to the story of Jesus when he helped a blind man see. And this is, as I say, this is what Bob Cratchit referred to when they came back from the church. Now, this biblical analogy, straight up, it's likening Tim to Jesus, isn't it? Both of these men, both Tim and Jesus, have been sent by God to save us. And the blind man, in this case, who needed help to see, was of course Scrooge. He was blind to the impact of his greed and his selfishness, and Tiny Tim helped him see the error of his ways. Now, Charles Dickens gets like really quite personal on this one, because he just literally drops in the middle of nowhere without any sort of context, any sort of discussion, that Tiny Tim was a gift from God. And there isn't a character that says that. It's just the narrator of the book just bursts out, "It's a gift from God." Now, Dickens is deliberately tying this idea of gifts from God to the surplus population who Tiny Tim represents. So therefore he's showing that these people, they offer no financial contribution, but they are gifts from God. They benefit our world immeasurably, and they are God's people as much as anyone. Okay, he is saying that these people that you are starving, that you are putting in the workhouses, that you are criticising, they have just as much right to God's earth as you or I. Now, obviously, to connect him to God, well, that makes his death a heresy, and that significantly accentuates the damage, the emotional damage of killing off Tiny Tim. Tiny Tim not only needs to be protected because he's a great little lad, but he needs to be protected because to not protect him would be heresy, would be a crime against our God. And as a society, that is exactly what we are doing. And every one of these little lads who starves or dies or gets sent to the workhouse or prison, Dickens is telling us that's a crime against our Holy Father. Now, if you wanted to go even deeper, I think you can have a little closer look at the story in the Bible. And I think it's quite interesting that in that story, when after Jesus has helped the blind man see, he tells him, don't go back into the village. So the village where he lived, he told him not to go back in, i.e. to show that this miracle, people needed to believe that the miracle had happened rather than actually seeing the miracle. Now, that idea of concealing the miracle and concealing what happens, that runs all the way through Tiny Tim, doesn't it? Because we never actually see, or Scrooge in his life until he met these ghosts, he never actually saw the impact he was having, never actually saw how blind he was, and therefore this hidden miracle is something that he has to believe to come to fruition. Then my third paragraph, I'll be talking about these two quotes together really. This is when Tiny Tim has died, and Dickens described the house as quiet, very quiet, and that the family had been reconciled to what had happened. So repeating that word quiet, Tiny Tim didn't bring any money, but he did bring the life, the joy and soul to the family, and now he's gone, it's painfully quiet. We've also got minor sentences here, and we've got quiet, full stop, very quiet, another full stop. Now that forces the pauses and the silence, so that contrasts with the life and energy of Christmas when Tiny Tim was there. And also we've got the fact that he reconciled what had happened. Bob had accepted this death. Now, the reason why Bob could accept the death so easily was because it was inevitable. It was always going to happen. Tiny Tim was at the mercy of the poor law and at the mercy of society, and society's intolerance for these people who did not financially contribute to our society. It was always going to. It was written in the stars that Tiny Tim was going to die. So there's no need for Bob to be upset about it. Now, this also feeds into the Victorian tradition of Christmas. Christmas obviously falls at the back end of the year, and death was a fairly common thing in Victorian Britain. And so Christmas was very traditionally a time for remembering loved ones who had passed in the year just gone. And as we all know, Christmas is that time we should be spending with our family. And so it's particularly painful that Tiny Tim, such a precious part of that family, is not there. Finally, I'll be ending in my final paragraph, and I've got to give it to Tiny Tim's last line. God bless us, everyone. So at the end, happy days. Tiny Tim does not die, and so the fact that he hasn't died, that's Dickens showing this is never too late for us to change, and we would be saving a life of someone who otherwise would be living desperately. Now, I think it's really interesting that that Dickens ends it with God, and then the community, and then the collective society that we all exist in. So first of all, God, that continues that biblical analogy, and that if we are to live in peace and harmony and unity all of our lives from start to back, just like Tiny Tim is referred to the Bible from front to back all the way through his little life. But then he also says it ends with everyone, and that everyone was just there's collective responsibility to help each other, but also forgive each other. This is a lad who could very easily have died. He was at the mercy of the poor law, and the fact that he hasn't, and whether he, even when he was in poverty and also when he was after poverty, when Scrooge was looking after him, he was still saying, God bless us everyone, in both those places. There is always a place for people to look after each other, and there is always a place for people to allow that to happen by forgiveness. I would think it's really beautiful that Scrooge and Tim end the story together. It symbolises how they both exist because of the other. Scrooge saved his life, and Tiny Tim saved Scrooge's life, and I think that's really, really nice. And then I think finally that last reference to bless us. The poor, he's not asking for anything other than God's blessing. He just wants God's blessing for a chance to live. Okay, so that's what I'd say about Tiny Tim. Hopefully that's been useful. Good luck for your exams.